So, Charles Nduka, thank you very much for joining us, or joining me, I should say, on this first episode of our podcast at Future Visual. And this podcast is called Building New Realities. And
thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. And obviously, when we were thinking of the title, Building New Realities, we were thinking, obviously, Future Visual. We work in immersive tech. It's about building new environments. And we've obviously met to discuss your work, and I really want to sort of dig into some of the work you do in the medical field, because you are building new realities for people there. But obviously, in the context of what's going on this week, for those of you in the future, this podcast is being recorded on March the 20th, 2020. We are approaching the eye of the COVID outbreak, and obviously Charles works in the medical profession, so we'll get into some of that in a bit. But yeah, this is a sort of era of building a new reality I couldn't have possibly imagined.
That's right. It's very strange times we're living in just now. As you say, we are a little bit behind what's going on the continent. We are anticipating things to get significantly worse. Next week, personally, I'm going into training on the respiratory side, because it's going to be all hands on deck. So yeah, very interesting times to be alive.
So yeah, just to give a bit of background on yourself, you are a consultant plastic reconstructive and cosmetic surgeon. You've obviously been or worked in the medical sector for 25 years. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
But you're also co-founder and chief scientist of Emteq, which is a company building hardware within the immersive sector, but also for the rehabilitation of patients. So I guess just to find out a bit more about your background, when did you start training as a doctor, and when did you decide that you wanted to move into reconstructive surgery?
So it's embarrassing to say that I was influenced by TV. I watched a documentary when I was about 15 about a little boy with facial deformities. It was on the BBC about a boy called David. He was abandoned at an orphanage in South America. And a surgeon used to go and do missionary work, and he operated on the child over the course of several years and rebuilt his nose and mouth. And it was an extraordinary story. It followed him over a period of time, over years, and eventually they actually adopted this child. And that was really inspiring. The idea that this child would have basically died without this very compassionate approach, and recognizing how his facial disfigurement would cause him to be cast aside by his own parents. So that was my decision at age sort of 15, 16, and I went into medicine, lucky enough to go to Oxford for my undergraduate, but always had this vision to do reconstructive plastic surgery. Partly because I recognised, maybe being black, maybe recognising some struggles my parents had, I was always aware that how one looks affects how one is treated, how one interacts with the world. I had a bit of bullying myself at school when I was sort of 7, 8, which I think maybe influenced also my decision making, recognizing that if you can't integrate into the world around you, that can cause some really bad outcomes. And I saw some of that in my personal life with my siblings. So yes, I went into training. My first medical jobs were in Imperial College in London. I was lucky enough to work with an amazing professor called Aradazi, who's a surgeon, but also a really amazing technology pioneer. He developed lots of new techniques and learned a huge amount from him. And then I sort of went on to my surgical training in and around London, and rounded my training off in France and Brazil, and then became a consultant in 2006 in East Grinstead, which is the regional centre for plastic reconstructive surgery for all of Kent, all of Sussex, and parts of Surrey. Amazing.
So where was this? Where was this child? Which country was he living in when you saw this TV show?
I think it's Peru. He was Peruvian, I believe, and he is now. So he was adopted by the surgeon, and he's now a medical photographer living in. I think it's in Chicago. There now. He's a fully grown adult. So this was 30 odd years ago. But yeah, just amazing, an amazing story. Desmond Wilcox was the chap whose documentary it was, and yeah, it was really extraordinary how there's no medical background in my family, but how something, it triggered a spark in my brain that set me on this course. That's what I want to do. And yeah, I was lucky enough to be able to do it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story. That's amazing to hear. So those people who see something when they're quite young and it just flicks a switch and inspires them from a very young age, and they just kind of very clearly know what they want to do. I'm always slightly envious of those people because they've had a very clear path from a young age. I think personally I've more had to sort of leap from footpath to footpath and sort of carve it out and go, okay, I think this is what I'm inspired by and this is what drives me. But nothing is clear as seeing something like that and going, that's what I want to do. And when I was thinking about us having this conversation, I was really interested in you as a person, how far you were interested in that psychological aspect versus, just the sort of the mechanics. I was like, I know Charles, he seems a really lovely guy, but I wonder whether he's sort of a surgeon and from the technical point, or whether, in the context of building new realities when you're performing facial reconstructive surgery. I mean, you kind of answered it in a way because the first thing that inspired you was changing someone's life. But I was just interested in how much preparation or how much conversation goes into that psychological side of your patients, whether that's something you deal with or whether you liaise with other professionals.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So one of the things that, so to preface things, so my sister, who was just 1 year older than me, just over a year, she was 14 months older than me, she developed symptoms of schizophrenia at age 12, and she was in and out hospitals from mid-teens until she died prematurely for slightly unrelated reasons. But she really struggled with that. And my older brother, who's 4 years older than me, he suffered with depression and actually took his own life. So I had quite a close interaction with mental health issues for some time. I've always felt that the work that I do is almost, in a way, it's almost the surgical arm of psychiatry in a way, because, as I say, how a person looks can affect how a person feels, how a person's treated can affect how a person feels, and how a person looks can affect how a person is treated, if that makes sense. And so when I was at Oxford, I was lucky enough to do my intercalated degree on psychological disorders. So I really wanted to fully understand more deeply about mental health, and I guess maybe selfishly also wanted to understand myself. And we know that there are some genetic related factors in mental health conditions, and whether there was something I needed to understand about myself. The surgery itself, as I say, is almost the sort of the applied arm of mental health when it comes to someone's appearance. So in many cases, if someone's had a serious accident or cancer removed and they've been cured of that initial acute issue, what's left behind is the scarring, the disfigurements, which they have to live with. And in many cases, I've had patients tell me that, I can live with, for example, there's one lady who's had breast cancer. She had a breast removed, and she said, I can live with the breast cancer and having had a mastectomy because I can get dressed, put my prosthesis in my bra, and go out into the world, and nobody need to know. But she developed facial paralysis in her case, and it's there all the time. From the moment she wakes up, she goes to the bathroom, she looks in the mirror, and the first thing she sees is this reminder of this. In her case, it was a tumor that caused her facial paralysis, which she has to live with all the time, and with all interactions with people, with strangers. Patients often describe wanting to hide away, especially in school holidays when young children are around who stare and be unkind, unintentionally in most cases, but make the person feel very self-conscious. So surgery is, in a way, a form of treating the symptom of an underlying issue, but which principally is affecting how a person is received by society, and to allow them to perhaps better integrate into society, because we recognise that isolation, as I've experienced with my brother, can have very disastrous consequences.
Wow. Okay. So it sounds like you're really grounding it in the emotion. You're really basing everything you do in what stems from our most powerful organ, which of course is our mind and our perception of events and our perception of ourselves. The way you've described it is you're very aware of people's internal processes and their perceptions of themselves. And as you've just said, the surgery is a part that can help adjust that external perception, which is obviously manifested internally.
Absolutely. And so when I set up the service, so I got into facial paralysis as a subspecialty within plastic surgery because of a chap I saw. It would have been 2000, and I was working in London at Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel, and we had a huge number of patients come through with horrendous injuries. We had the helicopter service, so patients who had been run over by a train or by a lorry would come in with multiple injuries, and where they were.
They'd really been in a high stress situation. If they're coming in a helicopter, it was life or death. So, in minutes.
Absolutely, yeah. Some really horrendous injuries, and there was one chap who sat quietly in the. We had these really incredibly busy clinics, and we were having to see multiple patients and didn't have much time to allocate to them. There was one chap there who really caught my attention. He was sitting very quietly, very subdued, and my then consultant, I was a trainee, so my boss, he said, just going to see this chap, what's up with him, but he keeps coming back to the clinic, and I don't know what the deal is, and for some reason I just took some time with it, and he had a very, in the scheme of things, what seemed to be a very, very minor issue. He had his eyebrow on one side just wouldn't move, it wouldn't go up, and he was asking, could something be done about this? And it seemed as though you're a young guy, he was in his 30s. Why are you bothered by such a minor thing in the scheme of things? And it transpired that he had been, he was from Iraq, and he'd been tortured by Saddam Hussein's henchmen and been held for many weeks, beaten in all sorts of ways imaginable. In many cases, places that you wouldn't necessarily see on the surface. But at one point, he was hit severely on his head, and that injury damaged the branch that the nerve that supplied his forehead muscle. And he clearly had sort of post-traumatic stress, and part of it was that whenever he looked into himself, he was triggered by the fact that his facial is what's relatively minor asymmetry. That one brow was lower than the other and wouldn't move. That was a trigger for him, and actually the treatment for him was actually relatively straightforward. But I was only understanding the motivation of why he felt the way he was and why it caused him to withdraw and was constantly having to sort of relive the past was this external manifestation. So anyway, so I treated him, and in his case, very minor. It's just actually just rebalancing his brow, and the change in his whole personality. You could see, he developed this sort of this almost this change in posture, this change in his it's something intangible, but anyway, it was quite remarkable, given that we were doing sometimes 4 or 5 hour surgery with some people, and seeing how this one adjustment for this patient could have such a big impact on his outlook.
Yeah, that's amazing. So it was the trigger when he saw that. It's like when we look in the mirror, and sometimes if we're feeling bad, you might have a negative internal view, or it might be like, you've got to do this, we're such sort of task-driven machines. And occasionally, if one's sort of working in one's internal state, you'll see yourself in the mirror and just be kind of supportive and encouraging. But every time he was looking in the mirror with that brow, it was just bringing it all back, and then sort of feelings of the actual pain and how he probably couldn't move forward in his life.
Absolutely. He was literally introspecting. He was looking into himself, but also into the past. And obviously, if you want to move forward, you need to look out into the world and also look into the future. And he was doing. So, so it was quite. And so I really dug into facial paralysis, and it wasn't something that was really, to a large degree, taken very seriously in the UK. And I set up a service at the hospital, Queen Victoria Hospital, with a great team of people. Psychological therapist, physiotherapist, speech-language therapist, an eye specialist who deals with the issues of patients not being able to close their eyes. And very quickly we were sort of overwhelmed. The number of people from all over the country to come and see us for treatments. But there was this large body of people who had intact nerves, but who had facial deformities that were mostly due to the fact that the nerves weren't quite functioning properly, and they weren't candidates for surgery as such, but they needed to do things to help themselves in terms of retraining. Now, if you injure your arm or your leg, you get to see the therapist and tell you what to do, and you can monitor your progress by just looking. You see your range of motion, you can see whether you're able to bend your arm or your leg in the same way that you can on your healthy side. With your face, it's different because you need some feedback, and in many cases, we're asking patients to work with a mirror to help to rebalance and retrain their facial muscles. And patients come back to me week after week, month after month, and they weren't making progress. I was trying to dig into why. One of the reasons was that they were not actually looking in the mirror. They found it distressing, and
seeing themselves in the mirror, they were reinforcing that things weren't right and that they weren't making tangible, immediate progress, which of course doesn't happen.
Exactly. And so we use a system called Electromyography, which is it's like a sensor on the skin that you measure the muscle signals. It's like a microphone, if you like, listening to the muscle signals under the surface. And we use it in the clinic, and it helps patients to kind of visualize what the muscles are doing and to help them retrain. Patients kept asking, what can I do to get one of these devices to use at home? Because at least I wouldn't have to look in the mirror. I can just get that immediate feedback about how I'm progressing. And that got me thinking about, well, could we develop something that was able to be used for patients at home to do their own home-based rehabilitation? And so I dug into that, and anyway, so from that, I thought, well, I had this idea, it's a concept. I did some research. I filed the initial patent back in 2012, and that wasn't granted until about 4 years later. But in the meantime, got some funding to do some preliminary research, which was funded by Health Research. And that got us on our way. And eventually, we formed Emteq in 2015-16. And that's where we started this journey down technology development.
So how many people out of the population does facial paralysis affect? Is it quite a common thing, or what are the numbers?
So most people will say the lifetime risk of facial paralysis due to Bell's palsy, which is the commonest cause. So Bell's palsy is a subset which comes on typically overnight. You wake up one day and bang, one side of your face doesn't work. About 60% of facial paralysis cases are Bell's palsy. Bell's palsy itself happens in the UK. It's about between 23 and 25,000 cases a year. But fortunately, about 70% will recover spontaneously within weeks. But that leaves about 30% who will be left with some ongoing issue of asymmetry, spasms, or lack of expressivity. And for those patients, that it's quite distressing, especially if your job involves facing the public. Many of my patients are people like teachers, people working in sales, people working as lecturers, actors, performers. Often it can be career-ending, if you're working in a role as an entertainer, for example. And for those patients who have this incomplete recovery, in most cases, surgery isn't an option for them because the nerve is intact. It's just a lack of coordination. And that is for those patients that we are looking to improve their outcomes by providing them with this rehabilitation system.
Great. So obviously that's Emteq. That's the core focus of Emteq is essentially building rehabilitative hardware. Now we visited your office, and obviously you're doing a lot of dev as well. If you just want to tell us a little bit about what you're able to tell us, I'm sure lots of it is under NDA or confidential at the moment. If you just give us a bit of an idea about your kind of product roadmap, products that you're hoping to get to market.
Yes. So at the core, we felt that virtual reality as a technology has an amazing potential because it is, of all technologies, the most intimate you can imagine. It's not only worn on the body, it's worn on the face. It's also in contact with all our sensory organs. It's in contact with your eyes, with visual stimulus. It's in contact with your ears, providing you sound. But also importantly, it's in touch with the skin of your face, particularly around the eyes where the key muscles of expression are located. And so the idea was to embed biometric sensors within the headset, within the foam padding, that allow us to simultaneously monitor what the person is experiencing and how they're responding. So in the case of our improved system, which is for facial paralysis, this is for patients able to actually visualize their facial muscle activity whilst they're being stimulated, or convert their signals into an avatar on a screen so they wouldn't have to look at their reflection in the mirror, to provide them with that vital feedback as part of their progress. So that's the facial paralysis part. but there's larger pictures. And we've just recently received funding from the NIHR, National Institute of Health Research, for a project around mental health using the same underlying system. Because if a person, for example, suffers with a fear of public speaking, for example, it's very hard to get over that, because we know that if you have a fear and you try to overcome that fear, but you have a bad experience, you're less likely to try and do it again, because if you suddenly feel stressed and anxious and it overwhelms your ability to cope at that time, you'll want to not do it again. By being able to monitor a person's responses in real time whilst they're being stimulated by whatever challenging scenario it is, be it giving a speech, or being confronted with a spider, or being on a tall building if you have a fear of heights, or being in a shopping centre if you have fear of open spaces, we're able to monitor both the patient's emotional responses through their facial expressions and their biometric responses. We're also measuring heart rates and heart rate variability from the face as well. Then we're able to tune the experience, i.e. the intensity of the experience, to their responses. So they never get overwhelmed. They're always at a state where they are able to cope, go a bit further, stimulate a bit further, check the response, and titrate the experience so that they can achieve mastery over time.
And I'm imagining that the face actually probably is a great spot for picking up signals. I know what you're working on is picking up, so some micro fluctuations that most of us won't be familiar with their names or what the context. Most of us are familiar with perhaps eye dilation, pupil movements, obviously
yes.
heart rate, perhaps even temperature. But I know there's some real other subtleties that you're working on, which is really your sort of niche value proposition.
That's right. The facial muscles, they are being monitored at 1,000 times a second with our system. So we're looking at really, really small changes in the electrical activity, and some of which aren't visible on the surface. Can't be seen. They can be perceived because our eyes actually sample at a much higher rate than we can see on the screen. For example, when you're looking at 30 times a second, our eyes actually have a much higher frame rate, if you like, and we pick up these subtleties when interacting with people. And this is why realize why the person, when you meet them, you think, oh, I don't quite trust that person. Actually, you are subconsciously picking up on these micro expressions that a person is emitting without being aware of it. And obviously, actors are able to convince people through being able to manipulate how they present themselves in the world.
And these micro expressions, they're normal muscles, but I think what I'm understanding is that our normal muscles are actually in constant movement, like a little bit like a wave. And because they're so small, we just can't perceive it.
Absolutely. The wave is a really good analogy, because if you think about the sea and the turbulent sea, there's a huge amount of activity going on underneath there. And sometimes you'll get waves that will come above and create a ripple on the surface. If you get a confluence of waves, that can cause not only a ripple in the wave, but also some cresting of the wave, and you'll see some foam. And that's what you're seeing on the surface, where you see the gross expressions. At rest, your face has an inherent, what we call tone, which is like a baseline level of activity, which is where this is what gives its kind of baseline appearance. And if the tone is high, as you'll see in somebody who is stressed, it manifests as deepening of the fold between the corner of the nose and mouth. We may see some slight furrowing of the brow. We can perceive these things subconsciously, and this is why you may see somebody think, and somebody you know well, for example, you say, what's wrong, or how are you feeling? If you know that person well, you perceive these things subconsciously, and you detect them in the same way that you would say to somebody, well, you're looking tired. You've picked up multiple subconscious little signals that all coalesce together and communicated to you that this person isn't as they normally are. So it has to be contextual, and it has to be multimodal. It's not just one thing. So, for example, furrowing up a brow could mean many things. It could mean a person is angry, yes. It could mean a person is frustrated. It could mean a person is confused. It could mean a person is looking at a bright light and is just trying to shield their eyes. It has to be looked at in context of what that person is experiencing, which is why VR is so powerful. You can see what the person is experiencing.
Right, because you're changing their reality, you're changing their environment. And do you do a process of kind of calibration? Because like from person to person, obviously some person might get completely freaked out if there's two doors in a room. Do you have like a sort of calibration person to sort of to register their variability, or they're responsive to slightly unusual scenarios.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the problems around considering facial expression and inferring behaviors is there's been this idea in the past that everyone's the same, everyone responds in the same way, and that clearly isn't the case. There's lots of good evidence now coming out recently, particularly the work by an amazing researcher called Lisa Feldman Barrett, that shows that actually there isn't a universal response.
What was her name?
Her name is Lisa Feldman Barrett. She wrote a great book called How Emotions Are Made, and more importantly, she wrote a fantastic review of all the literature around facial expressions, which was published last year. And what it shows is that if you just look at a face out of context of what it is experiencing, actually most people find it very difficult to recognize what that response means. But if you understand the context to it, let's say what was communicated to that individual at that time, and you understand that individual, then of course you can infer. And what you can infer is that person expressing something positive versus negative, and is that person agitated versus calm or relaxed or fatigued. So this is a much better model, and it's how we interact with people around us. This is how you know when your loved one, your partner, your close friend is feeling the way they are, because you learned a personalized model of how that person normally behaves. And when they deviate from that normality, then your brain is synthesizing all those signals and saying, this isn't normal, this person is more negative than they normally are, or more positive, or they're more agitated, or less so. So we're looking at both expressions, we're looking at movement, we're looking at measures of activation of the nervous system, so-called physiological arousal through heart rates and heart rate parameters. And the key thing is around context. So you mentioned about calibration. Yes, there is a calibration which is necessary. We were lucky enough to do a very large-scale study at London's Science Museum last summer, where we had almost 800 participants.
That's right. I think that's we saw you around that time, and obviously putting on an event like that is very, very challenging. Look forward to hearing that later.
Yeah, we had this amazing opportunity. One of our research engineers, Ifigenia Mavridou, she kind of led that in collaboration with our university partners at Bournemouth University, where we had volunteers, members of the public, going through an experience that was obviously we had to go through formal ethics approvals, and people had to give informed consent. And basically, we designed 3 experiences: a neutral, a positive, and a negative one, where a person had to go through a task, a memory task, and we basically measured how they responded to that environment. In the case of the positive one, it was all lovely and light and funny, and things were happening that were delightful. And in the negative one, it was the room was filled with it was dark, with spiders and rats, and there was a fire started, and it became more and more intense. And it was really fascinating. But anyway, the results from that study, and obviously in addition to that, the participants also filled in a number of questionnaires and validated psychological assessments. We're just writing up the data from that, because it was a huge amount of data from that many participants, and that's going to be published later on this year. But what it does show is that you can infer a huge amount up to a certain level without calibration per se, but that fine-grained stuff that we use day to day, the people that we know, that requires much more sort of long-term understanding.
Right, so it's quite a complex process to do it in an effective way, rather than a nod to trying to calibrate. Quite often, these sort of you mentioned putting people through an event type experience, and obviously when you go into those events, quite often you just calibrate your size. Put your arms out, stand up, turn around, that kind of stuff. Very, very basic physical calibration, which is pretty straightforward compared to when you're trying to calibrate what someone's actual emotional resonance or reaction to stimuli are. There's so many different ways you can.
That's right. So one of the things we had to do, one basic calibration is just literally just what a person is at neutral and their maximum response. That's a simple thing that we do, because that way you can now, when they're in experience, when they express something, see how that relates to their maximum response. And that's kind of a sort of per person normalization. But then there are other things as well. So as well as a game experience, they also watched standardized stimuli that have been validated in other studies to allow us to titrate their response in the VR experience to their response to these stimuli, which were in form of videos actually. So it was a really complex study to conduct, and huge volume of data to go through as well. It's the first time we ever did our system where we had people in the field. The data was being mapped, annotated, sent into the cloud, obviously securely, and then installed and then for subsequent processing.
So we're starting to get into that area of kind of new realities that can be created by VR. You know, we're starting to talk about those kind of mental reactions, which is, you know, obviously we're just at the very early stages with that. That's why it's fascinating to talk to someone like you, because, you know, you're actually measuring what people's responses are. You know, from my side, Future Visual, you know, we're actually looking at creating environments that are more specific for a task. I mean, one of our briefs was around, you know, we had a brief from a behavior change client, and the brief was, can you get people to reveal their true behavior? And you know, we started to think about it. Okay, God, how do we do this? Do we do a kind of role-playing thing? And we ended up building you know, essentially it was like a location-based piece of entertainment. I don't know if you've tried The Void. Have you tried The Void?
I haven't tried The Void, no. I've tried some similar things. It's closed down now, but in Los Angeles, I think it was about a year and a half ago, there was a location-based experience there, which involved you having a backpack and a gun, and it was amazing, actually. A really, really immersive experience.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, carry on. I mean, I think your stuff, I think, is fascinating. You know, we met, I think it was last year, and had a demo of your system for multi-person VR. And I think the synergy between what you're doing and what we're doing is interesting. And what you mentioned before around trying to understand a person's true behavior is fascinating. I think that the best way to understand a person's true behavior is seeing them under stress. Yeah. And we're seeing a bit of that just now with what's going on with Carl. Seeing how some people respond in a very interesting way that relates to their underlying principles of how they see themselves and their place in society.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, we could go and talk about that thread. Let's stick on the thread which we've just started to dive into, which was creating sort of slightly new realities using VR. I mean, I read a study, I think about 2 years ago, where there was a VR company in association with a medical outfit, I think in Austria, somewhere like that. And they were actually building fictional representations of, let's call them people's demons or people's shadow characters. So again, in the sort of mental field, if someone had a very acute shadow that was causing them particular mental distress, you know, this is the kind of thing you might start to talk to a therapist about. So this was another slightly more extreme or intense version of that, where they actually created, it's a bit like your room with spiders and trying to gauge someone's reality. They were creating a visual representation of it, presumably so the person could interact with it in a kind of guided context, have a conversation with it, and then go, oh, that thing isn't real and elusive. I mean, that feels pretty experimental to me.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That was I think there was a study done. I'm not sure it's the same one that you're mentioning now at King's. And this is for patients with schizophrenia who hear voices, because one of the most distressing things about schizophrenia is that you have this voice inside your head, and what they were doing was to embody that voice into an external character, an avatar, that have the participant with the therapist describe what that person would look like based on that voice. And they would actually synthesize a voice so that the therapist could speak in the voice of the voice.
Wow, okay.
And so now the person could learn how to respond to the voice. So that voice is telling you, you're terrible. Why did you do that? You're an evil person. The person was being trained how to respond to those voices, and actually to either to ignore them or to
face them, to address them, or to go, yes, that's not right.
Exactly. So fascinating. I mean, it's an ongoing project just now, I think, at King's in conjunction with UCL, I believe, and I think it's a really, really interesting idea, because one of the most distressing things about schizophrenia is the idea of having this persistent negative voice in your head telling you that you're bad, you're evil, you're rubbish, and worse.
Interesting. So yeah, I mean, we're really getting into, you know, the psychology of humanity, and obviously that's sort of mirrored perhaps by a growth in the medical practice at large around what I'd call, you know, more normal treatments. Like you see treatments for depression, which are like, well, why don't you go and do some singing, or let's talk about it. And there's sort of huge growth in mindfulness, which I think is really encouraging because, you know, traditionally our pedagogy or our medical pedagogy has been, you know, here, take this, do that. And we're seeing much more of a, from what I can see, a much more of a swing or an openness to just normal activities, which perhaps have been lost in our scientific, industrial, you know, process, industrial driven society. How do you see the rise of sort of mindfulness as a treatment in the medical profession?
I think it's a really important step forward, recognizing that the mind has got an incredible role to play. I mean, I'll never forget seeing a chap when I was in training who had been bitten by a shark in Thailand, and so he had a huge chunk of tissue removed by this shark from his thigh. And you know, this goes to show how the mind. You know, he said he felt nothing, he felt no pain at the time because he was obviously wanting to survive. And clearly, events can happen to a person, but your perception of the event has a really important role to play. And this is how your mind has a top-down role to play on how you experience your bodily symptoms, and vice versa. You know, we know now that there are more nerves going from the gut to the brain to the gut. You know, we talk about gut feelings, and actually that's now recognized as being a real thing.
The vagus nerve, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. We have multiple connections going from this very, very core thing that we use to ingest energy that allows us to live, communicating with our brain. And so recognizing that, you have to start off from the perspective of calm and understanding your inner arousal levels, if you like, to be able to go to the next level of then how you interact with the world. And this is kind of core to what we're building, because being able to actually give you better feedback, it's really hard. I don't know if you ever tried meditating or tried mindfulness. It's actually really, really difficult to get going, and people often lose confidence and get frustrated and stop. Being able to add some degree of feedback so you can learn, that's a really powerful way of making progress, because if you can feel you're making progress, you'll be motivated to do it again and do it again, do it again.
Yeah, we react very powerfully, don't we, to an indicator of progress. You know, as humans, if we're told, oh, you did better this time, then yeah, we're so primitive in so many ways, aren't we? Like because when we see that, we get a little dopamine hit, and we're like, oh, I'm going to do that again.
Exactly, and we you know, we can see how that can be really, really successfully applied in certain things, both in the commercial world and in healthcare, like. So we'll see that if you have a means, if you're trying to lose weight, for example, you have a scale that gives you some kind of feedback on your progress, but we know that's not enough. You also need some other forms of reinforcement and support, which is why things like weight watching clubs can be really beneficial. If it's something in the form of an app, people now gamify apps to give you that variable reward that we know that gives people incentive to keep going, which is what gambling casinos know about, which is what apps like Brand know about in terms of how many likes they get and this sort of thing. These mechanics, which are now being really understood well. Some great books recently published about this stuff. So one by a chap called BJ Fogg called Tiny Habits, and he talks about a lot about the mechanics by which people form their behaviors. Another one by a chap called Nir Eyal, EYAL, called Hooked. He was involved in lots of habit-forming apps as a consultant back in the day, and he's now in his payback time trying to help people to become unhooked from many of these apps that are now running lots of people's lives.
Yeah. So yeah, we've touched on perception of events and really how the mind's perception of what's going on is really at the core of everyone's experience. And obviously what you're doing is trying to help people, empower people, deal with some of that. If we go into the sort of the week we're in now, the larger picture of COVID-19, how are you seeing obviously you're inside the medical profession, how are you seeing the sort of general response or sort of mustering to what could be coming?
So it's an interesting time right now, and obviously only I guess the future will judge actions and decisions that have been made up until now. We do know that it's likely to be quite severe for some people. All we have is evidence of what's gone on in other countries to look at the trajectory of number of cases that we'll see. We can see writ large how our brains look at the signals around us, and we see people behave in a certain way. We take notice of that, and so if you see people panic buying things, we think, well, something's going on here, and I need to do the same thing just in case they know something I don't know. Then we get every single person who's alive today is alive because one of their ancestors saw something that was potentially negative and moved away from it, and that's what allowed them on their genes. And this is why we have this bias towards paying attention to other people's behaviors, this sort of this form behavior. And it's worth bearing in mind, one of the things that I worry about a lot around this time is that a lot of the fear that's being sort of promulgated can have negative outcomes because it creates stress, and stress has an effect itself on the immune system. So I think
it could actually lower the immune system and make people more vulnerable. When you're a sort of knife edge case.
Yes, it's been known for many years. The stress response, one of the key things around it, cortisol. Cortisol is a substance produced in the body which is an immunosuppressant. So it suppresses the immune system. This is why we know that people with mental health conditions, for example, with a chronic mental health condition plus one other medical condition such as diabetes or heart disease, your life expectancy can be shortened by up to 20 years. So it is an issue, which is one of the reasons why there's an old saying which is don't let anybody walk through your mind with their dirty feet. Be careful about what things you allow into your mind, in terms of the things you read, things that you interact with online, because it can sully your experience and actually sully the experience of people around you, because if they make you feel fearful, then you can spread that to other people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been reading a few things online, and obviously, I've tried to limit my online exposure a bit because everyone's posting views and craziness. And I read a very moving thing this week, actually, that was someone had written, I think it was someone called Kirsten, I can't pronounce her surname, it's like SYNZ. I believe when one does a podcast, one sticks it in the comments afterwards. So I'll dig out the name and stick it in the comments. But she'd written this piece that was a message, as if it was a message from COVID-19. And it was saying, I'm here to make you stop. We've had wildfires burning in Australia. You haven't listened. We've had this going on. You haven't listened. I'm actually here to help. Although we've got this very scary 3-month, 12-month, 18-month window coming up, when you look at sort of, the Earth as a holistic system, more kind of like the Gaia perhaps model. Yeah. This is just a small insight into how nature runs things. And, with our little industrialized heads running around thinking we're being super clever and there's going to be this much growth in aviation over the years, it's like nature's just covered. This is just not even an appetizer, is it, to what could happen when nature turns. So, and I think that potentially, depending on your worldview, I think personally, I feel that actually this is quite an interesting moment to us to enforced reassessment of values and actions, because when you look at what's happening economically, and you listen to economists and bankers, and everyone thinks they're very clever, having these oh, don't worry, we're re-leveraged and we've got all these financial mechanisms and and it's the same old story every time, isn't it? It's like really complex smoke and mirrors to go, actually you're just ballooning it. And some of the things that are about to go down. I mean, I read something this morning where a fairly senior banker said this is going to make Lehman's look like a child's play. And when you read statements like that, you're like, oh, okay, this really is going to be heavy. Yes. The sell-off in the States on the Dow, it's got a faster trajectory than the 29 depression. And, a lot of companies are massively over-leveraged because they've gorged on cheap debt. Interestingly, the response from governments and central banks is going to be like, drop the interest rate, have some more money. And we've just got wafer-thin leverage opportunities this time. There's really nowhere to go. It's kind of like, no, this doesn't work. And, when you look at the bigger picture of economies growing in the way that they have done, there just comes a point where the rubber has been burning on the road, and eventually you run out of rubber and you get to your wheel hub, and it's like, okay, how long can you make this wheel hub last? Or because if you keep ragging it on a wheel hub in the way you are, you're going to be down to that axle and it's all going to fall apart. So some part of me does think that this is going to be a very interesting it needs to be, or could be, an interesting recalibration of economic systems, and more importantly, I think personal interactions and values, right? Because we all run around, our primary goal as humans is to try and be happy. We just have come up with this slightly tortuous, long-winded, list-orientated, goal-orientated way of doing it. So I wondered, you probably, perhaps you haven't had time to look at it within those holistic systems. You're very busy with the company, and I believe you're being redrafted to actually go and help with this crisis.
Yeah, I think there's a few things you said there are really, really fascinating. I'd love to, first of all, if you could put a link to that article, I'd love to see it.
Which one? The story, as if it was from coming from COVID.
Yeah. Because I do believe that although this is going to be terrible and the death and suffering that's coming is going to be awful, like most things that have a negative consequence, there will also be some upsides, and we're already seeing some of those just now, certainly within the health system. I mean, one of the reasons why we formed the company was to help people, but also to recognize that if you could help people help themselves, that's much more powerful. And sometimes you don't need a person to travel all the way across the country or for an hour to see a clinician. We have technology. We can do this remotely. We can do this from people's homes. And we're already seeing this now because we've now shut down much of our routine activity. And for patients who've had treatments but who need follow-up, we're now using telemedicine. So this has been, although awful, this is going to change the way we're thinking about healthcare, because we're now recognizing the power of remote assessments to minimize all the greenhouse gases and waste of materials for people traveling to and from hospital. We're already seeing the move to working from home, and that's something that's been known about for many, many years. IBM has been doing it for 30 years. Jason Fried wrote his book, Remote, which I read some years ago, and around recognizing that the culture can change. You don't always be co-located in the same place, and that will, I think, be a persistent change after this crisis is over. We're also seeing that if we do that, there's also an important need for us to avoid social isolation, because whilst we're communicating as we are just now via Zoom or similar teleconferencing tools, there is still a basic fundamental need for us to interact with people on a social basis, because we'll talk about it later on, but one of the issues that we know about is that bigger than alcohol, bigger than heart disease, the biggest cause of death is loneliness. And this is a work that was presented by a chap called John Capiocco. He's a psychologist who sadly died last year. But again, I'll send you a link to his fantastic TED talk about that. We need to enable people to interact with others, because without that, we die, or we become unwell. In terms of the global scheme, I think it is the case that this is about resetting things. It's about recognizing that we are one system, and that equilibrium has to come at some point. Sometimes it means having to take drastic action. So yes, if densities are too high, then populations will recalibrate. We know this in a petri dish. We know this here within a company. We know this on a national level as well, and on a global level.
So in some ways, although it's painful and scary, it's fascinating to see nature in action at scale. I mean, the world at the moment is the petri dish, right? And nature's coming in with the big pipette and going, "You need some of this."
It's really interesting seeing how, I don't know if you've seen the reports how in Venice, the fish are returning to the canals there. The water is
but very quickly, just like a couple of weeks.
Yeah, very quickly. And this is the beautiful thing about nature is that when there's been a resetting, and we've seen in the past when whale numbers have dropped really, really drastically, only within a few years, they're back to where they were before, because nature's got a huge capacity for buffering the system.
Yeah, so I really hope that some new way of interacting and business not as usual it perhaps needs to be our new modus operandi. The early signs are that this is going to be a significant enough hit that the counterpoint of business as usual will get a bit of a voice. This is even the most steadfast capitalist, efficiency-based kind of operative is going to have a bit of a scare with what we're going through. And it's interesting what you mentioned about, the value of personal interaction. And, as with much of life, the joy or the essence of it is kind of right in front of you, but we don't actually stop to just enjoy it because we're so conditioned from our list building ancestry, so we there's no reason to beat ourselves up about it. This is just the way we've evolved, and we've evolved to hunter gather, list, achieve, that's but no one sort of stopped to go, okay, it's all right, we've got enough now. You need to either help people who haven't got enough, or you need to sort of reach into yourself and your happiness levels a little bit more.
I mean, one thing you said earlier on, which I would pick up on, which is around the goal of life. So I would posit that the goals of life isn't actually happiness at all. On a purely objective level, there's nothing normal about happiness in the same way there's nothing normal about unhappiness. They're both abnormal states. Happiness cannot can't sustain, because it's not a state of equilibrium. It's unbalanced as being unhappy. And the only thing that should be persistent is a sense of progress. People want to feel a sense of progress. And the reason why, and this has been researched numerous times before, how if you look at somebody who has experienced a significant positive event and a significant negative event, you look at them a year later. So in this case, the study was looking at people who won the lottery versus people who had experienced a major limb amputation, like they've lost a leg.
Yes.
And you look immediately after that event and look at their levels of quality of life and self-rated happiness. If you've lost a limb, obviously you're going to feel very, very low, very depressed. Just won lottery, you're going to feel incredibly positive, happy and enthusiastic. Just a year later, people equilibrate. Those who'd lost a leg were feeling much better about themselves and positive about the future. Those who'd won lottery were actually feeling much less positive about the future. You look at the graph of income versus happiness, and it tops out at about $60,000 per household, which is about $30,000 per person. If you're thinking about a nuclear family. And there's a reason for that. That if you have not very much, of course, there's a correlation between your income and your levels of self-rated happiness. But it tops out at a relatively low level.
Yeah, it's about 60K, isn't it? Sort of life doesn't get much.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so what people really want is a sense of progress more than anything else. And for many people who have a goal around, for example, money, once you've topped out at that level, you've got all the money, they want to make progress, which is why they go off and do crazy things, such as, all the crazy things that we see people do, buying multiple jets and yachts.
Well, that's actually, that kind of, you're starting to go into craving there. You're quite right to pick up on my point of happiness. Perhaps rather than happiness, a better description would be sort of imbalance or inequilibrium. Because I would also counter that perhaps progress and this constant need for progress means one is searching to go forward, and therefore one is not living in the present. You mentioned meditation. I've done quite a lot of meditation, so and that is all about being in the moment and not about craving and delusion. So yeah, happiness is an abnormal state, as you've mentioned. So, but more importantly, it's about being in balance. And I think being in balance can feel like making like progress, because as humans, we have these craving and delusion tendencies. We can be up and down, up and down, up and down. Remain in balance. That feels like does feel like progress, because you're able to absorb what's going on.
It utterly is on a purely thermodynamic basis, because the only thing that you can rely on is the fact that the world is chaotic. The entropy is increasing in the world. Therefore, if the entropy is increasing in the world, the only way to stay in balance is for you to be able to absorb those changes, those fluctuations that are going to be hitting you from different directions, and either to absorb them or to integrate them into your life. And that's did
you describe that as a thermodynamic?
Yes. Okay, so how I think about things is that so fundamentally, obviously, energy can't be created or destroyed, and that the universe is expanding. Therefore, entropy is increasing. Therefore, for an individual to stay in thermodynamic balance, then they have to take more energy from the environment than they are using, obviously. And if you're experiencing chaotic events, you have to either be able to absorb them into your constituent parts, or to integrate them. And integrating them, what that means is basically acceptance of the experiences, acceptance of the toils and trials and tribulations of the world. That's part of what is being taught with meditation. It's about acceptance, and that's how you maintain that balance, that contentment.
That is fascinating. I'm so glad we touched on that, because I've never heard, meditative state described in a sort of from a scientific perspective so accurately. A thermodynamic state of the world, and that if we are having to absorb chaotic events, then we have to do something with that energy. So that's very, very interesting. I like that. So I thought we had a great little segue there. So just going back to your work, what are the technical challenges to your work?
Where do you start? I mean, there's so many. We have a technology that's worn on the face. So fundamentally, you have an issue around comfort. You have an issue around fit. People's faces vary tremendously in their shape and their form. The latency is always an issue as well when you're doing any kind of communication. So as we're speaking by Zoom just now, the maximum latency we can have between the words leaving my mouth and entering your ear is about 150 milliseconds, because if it's longer than that, what happens is that we end up talking over each other. And we've experienced that sometimes before when you have a long distance call, and the time that signals take to travel from one to the other is too long, and the voices end up overlapping. That's going to be improved, obviously, with 5G. That'll make the kind of things that we're talking about in terms of with what your company is doing, which is amazing, remote collaboration, and what we're doing in terms of enabling that more intimate interaction. Those things are vital. The other challenges are around obviously distribution, because obviously it's hardware, and hardware comes with quite a cost. This is why we're starting off with a relatively narrow niche, initially facial paralysis, and then moving on to mental health conditions. In the future, we're going to look back at this time just now and think, well, of course, so much of what we're doing in terms of both business travel, in terms of meetings, is to get around this bandwidth issue of interaction. When we speak face to face, it's a very, very wide bandwidth of communication of both verbal and non-verbal communication. The reason why we don't seal important deals by email is because we want more bandwidth in that communication. So we might move to something like a phone call, from a phone call to a Skype. But ultimately, the deal isn't signed until you meet that person, look them in the eye, and shake their hand. That's about increasing amount of interaction.
Sealing the deal, isn't it? I love the description there of emotional bandwidth. It's like you'll only seal the deal when you feel you've kind of got the organic kind of stamp.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that makes the technologies that you're developing, that we're developing, I guess. We're not competing with the telephone. We're competing with airplanes and hotels and.
Well, this week we've had quite a tailwind. I mean, again, it goes back to that sort of intervention by COVID-19, and it going, no, this air travel is not good. It's not working. I mean, we had a board meeting yesterday, and obviously I had to sort of give a sort of short-term, medium-term, long-term view. And the short-term view is that we could rush in trying to duplicate those office-type tools for immersive collaboration, but there's companies out there doing that, and it's not kind of our core value. Our medium-term view, which is of pulling people together in high-quality spaces that are relative to their work. So, if you were surgeon's training, it would be providing an operating theatre. If it was a real estate, it would be providing access to the drawing. So contextual environments, but our core technology is always improving the linking up of VR, AR, desktop, and mobile. But in my assessment yesterday, I had to say, I think what's going on in the world has given our collaborative tool sector, a much greater tailwind than just kind of organic growth. At the moment, you have conversations with people, and obviously there's a lot of enthusiasm because it's VR, you're doing collaboration, it's great. And then it is always a challenge, as you all know, of demonstrating ROI, getting them to actually put the money down. Whereas I think now, the relevance of our offering has gone much further up the agenda. I mean, at a primary level, it's like, well, we can actually make meetings happen that can't happen at the moment. You can facilitate events that can't happen. And then if you go into that sort of medium-term view, it's like, well, even if you do want to have physical events again in the future, if you build or replicate your event using our system, then that's open 365, 24/7, and also as a plan B to these kind of events. But hopefully, as we just discussed, it actually leads to a new way of people doing business. It's like, actually, I don't need to go and fly around. I mean, potentially when you still come to sealing that deal, you might, people are potentially going to want FaceTime, but a lot of the other kind of legwork and endless time that goes into travel for other meetings. So I think COVID in a way has gone no to airlines, and hopefully it's given us its unacknowledged endorsement. I mean, building collaborative technology, I feel, is only one of the very few sectors this week where you can go, oh, actually, that's kind of good for our long-term view. Yeah,
absolutely. And obviously the other benefit is around training, because once you've been able to digitize an experience, you can now play it back.
That's right.
You can play it back now asynchronously, so you can now have people. In your case, for example, you mentioned about, say, a real estate thing or surgical training. Being able to digitize an experience and have somebody observe it, and we're primates, monkey see, monkey do. We're able to synthesize this information, embody it, and then carry it out ourselves. And so,
there's a shout out, because we're talking to Innovate UK at the moment. One of the people there, Matt Sanson, alerted us to the fact there's obviously a very urgent call out from the government to manufacturers for building ventilators. Now, obviously, there'll be a bunch of components that have the CE stamp, that are approved, but there's going to be a bunch of other designs that are a bit more Apollo 13 in their style. Yes. We've got this box, we've got this tubing, and we've got this gaffer tape. Can we build a ventilator? Because we're going to potentially need a lot of them. So we put ourselves forward as being able to provide training on any new ventilator system that gets constructed, because within Vision XR we'll be able to have the equipment, we'll be able to be running, we'll be able to have 2 or 3 people doing the training, and those rooms will be duplicated. If you're needing to train hundreds of people a day, potentially we could scale up to go, okay, you're from a medical background. I mean, you might be getting nutritionists and orthopedics and dentists in at this point, depending on how high the sombrero goes. But yeah, it was, we'd love to get involved with that. And obviously it would be, it doesn't need to be super polished. It's that, what's the best way of getting this done quickly.
That's fantastic. I hadn't thought about that as an angle. I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking about is on Monday, I said we're having some of our training for this is beginning, but actually, by definition, all healthcare professionals are potentially super spreaders, because we're interacting with lots and lots of people, and it would be better if the training could be done in a way virtually, and VR would be potentially a great way of doing that. There is actually, I saw, there is a Facebook group where people are sharing ideas for how to put together these Apollo 13 style interventions to help people if resources are too limited. So yeah, an example of how technology can be used to share information in a much more effective way.
Great. So last couple of questions. If you had 100 million to spend on health tech for the UK and no red tape, what would you spend it on?
100 million on health tech. So if you look at the top 10 causes of premature death, you'll see that 70% of them have a strong element around emotions. You know, we think about heart disease, that's been known for many years. You know, certain type of personality types causes high blood pressure, higher risk of chronic disease. We look at obesity, that's self-medicating with food for issues that are emotional in their origin in many cases. Thinking about smoking, again, it's self-medication with tobacco and nicotine to try to manage stress and emotional responses. Alcohol, the same sort of thing. And then many cancers have a correlation with things like obesity. So emotions have a really powerful role to play in health outcomes. And we know that the two are synergistic. Poor mental health plus any one of the major health conditions will also reduce quality of life and actual risk of premature death. So that has to be put front and center. If I was going to spend £100 million, I would put it into early childcare. Because that's the point at which we need to recognize. I mean, you know, you have to have a license to drive a car, you have to have a license to have a dog. There's no license to understand. I mean, I'm a parent, I've got 2 boys. I would do things very, very differently now with all I've learned about psychology and mental health in terms of, I mean, I'm lucky that just by fluke, I can't claim any credit. Obviously, I've got an amazing wife who's done a wonderful job in my absence in many cases in bringing up these 2 boys. But I recognize how things could go wrong so easily, and the things that are done at the early stage have a massive impact on that person's individual in terms of how they eat, how they manage stress, how they manage their interactions, and how they see themselves as a player in society. So I put all of that money actually into early childcare. We recognize now in case of even within the womb, there are changes that happen to that fetus related to the maternal stress. A mother breast, she produces hormones in the blood that will go to the and responses that the fetus will experience through sounds and vibrations that will affect how genes are expressed. It's called epigenetics, and will cause that child to respond in certain ways, such as their responses to novelty, their ability to delay gratification, their ability to pay attention. All these things are affected, and how they manage their food are affected by things that happen even before they're born. And so we need to make sure that children, and actually pregnant women in particular, have as comfortable as possible an experience, as well as recognizing what's important, i.e. the long term.
And at what sort of age do you think like our habits and our world view of life is kind of ingrained? I mean, I know obviously it's not a fixed point. We can change it. There's, you know, obviously at the age of 3, 5, 7, we're what I would describe, perhaps incorrectly, as unconscious of a lot of it. You know, we're not doing a conscious analysis of threats and dangers. At what sort of age do you think most our sort of compass is set?
So the research, the epigenetic research shows that things that happen in the womb will affect behaviors such as diet, how much fat a person will store, for example, on consuming, and stress responses. I think that if you can intervene at the early stage, even before school, so between the ages of birth and 3, just thinking the additive effects and the trajectory of that individual's life, that will have the biggest impact. But that's not to say that people are fixed. But I think if you were going to choose a time point at which to have an impact, it would be really early on, because it's much harder to change behaviors that have become ingrained and automatic.
Got you. Well, that's lovely to hear. I mean, that truly is building new realities. You know, if you put the whole 100 million on children that aren't even born yet, and you know, aiming for a better environment and better life for them. I'm just conscious of the time. We've been going over for over an hour, so I feel that we could talk more and more. So I look forward to doing another one with you sometime. But Charles, thank you so much for taking the time to come and chat this morning.
No problem, Tim. It's been lovely talking to you, and I look forward to talking to you again.